We good? Awesome. Thanks, Mark. All right. Good evening. Thought I'd give a quick update because I haven't been here in a while due to things. Dad is back home. He got back home yesterday. They said they were going to be watching at home, so I'm sure they are. But he's doing well. He's resting. Everything kind of indicates that he'll resume his treatments again on Monday, and probably has some scans, or at least he's supposed to. So he's back home. For those that asked about William, he's fine. He's here. He's in class. He had pneumonia, and then we didn't announce this. Saturday, we ended up back in the hospital again. This time for William, he had a allergic reaction to something, probably food related, and he's good. I'm kind of still learning what life is like outside of a hospital right now. It's great, but for those that were wondering, I just thought I'd give that update, and all of us appreciate the thoughts and the prayers. This has been kind of out of nowhere, and we've really appreciated it. It really kind of strengthens us, as we're dealing with it. So, now to other things. This is the start of a new quarter. Myself, Kevin, and Russell, primarily Russell, will be focusing on a new class this quarter. And if these slides look familiar, you're not crazy. They are. These are things that we've discussed before. Jacob was kind enough to kind of let us use these, and we're going to revisit this series I think it's useful. I mean, the whole purpose throughout this quarter is going to be looking at important Old Testament parts, specifically Exodus and Leviticus, but looking at it through the lens of the New Testament. And I mean, just speaking for myself, I value that very highly because I can remember being in those pews, being in those classrooms, and being told and learning what was happening in these books. And so as an adult, it's very good for me to go back and think about these characters in the New Testament sense, which is what we're going to do. And as you can see, we're going to start with Exodus. In my opinion, Exodus is probably one of, if not arguably, the most important book of the Old Testament. If you want to think about it in the historical sense, we really have God, through Exodus, kind of reasserting himself into the world. We had Noah in Genesis, where God basically said, we're doing a do-over, we're starting over. Then he said he wasn't going to do that again. Here, though, I mean, we all know it, God is taking the time to basically show the dominant superpower of the day, Egyptians, that, hey, sorry, I'm going to quote a movie, I'm the captain now, okay? That's what we're getting here. And we're going to focus tonight on probably easily the most important character in Exodus, probably one of the more important characters in the Bible, and we're going to be focusing on Moses. So, does this work too? Yeah, I always point this at that thing like it's going to do anything, but it doesn't do it that way. Sorry. We're going to focus on Moses, and I really like Jacob's kind of comparison. I think it's definitely appropriate with the quincentennial. Did I say that right? Quincentennial we've got this weekend, 250 years. Jacob kind of compared Moses to what we might compare our founding fathers to. And I think that that's a very good comparison to kind of put it in relevant terms. Because, similar to, say, George Washington, who was able to deliver us and lead us through the American Revolution, kind of spearhead leading us into kind of starting our country. Moses did that for the Israelites in Egypt. Similarly, say a Thomas Jefferson, who we kind of credit with being able to conceptualize or come up with really what it means to be an American and putting it on paper, and we call it Declaration of Independence. Moses kind of did the same thing with the Ten Commandments. And then, even more so, we have someone like James Madison, who is credited with giving us the framework for our government after a failed attempt, if you know your history. But he was able to give us this framework that we still use. And it was kind of the first of its time, the constitutional republic that was made. And Moses was able to do that with the Israelites, especially after they had left Egypt. So really, I say all that to say just or reiterate how important Moses is. But hopefully, at least by looking at how the New Testament talks about Moses, we can take a few more things away from him. That one thing that I like to point out about Moses that I think is important, this is class, so please feel free to talk. If I talk too fast, ask me to repeat it. It's not a big deal. But just thinking back, when Moses was first approached by God, what was really one of the first things that he said? I think you got the wrong guy, is what he said. In fact, you might want to think about this guy over here, okay? I'm not the guy for this, okay? And in a real world sense, we can kind of relate to that. I think the worldly term for that kind of attitude is called imposter syndrome, kind of the idea that I'm not good enough. I appreciate it. I'm not capable of doing that. And to me, I find that very relative to us. We can relate to that. We've all had moments to where we've kind of questioned our own abilities. And Moses is very much exemplifying that. But still, even with that attitude, he's able to really just provide this pathway to so many important things. And as we go throughout this, we're going to see just how important he was, because that knowledge, that desire to revere Moses carries over into the New Testament. Not only that, I think a good fact that we have here, just talking about how often Moses comes up in the New Testament, he appears in the New Testament more times than any other name of an Old Testament character, over 80 times. About half of those are referenced in the Gospels. Almost always these references, they simply regard his writings as law, basically saying Moses commanded or something to that effect. And nobody really in the New Testament disagrees with Moses. I mean, sure, he was human, he had his imperfections, but that's just how revered he is in the New Testament. And so hopefully tonight, as we look at this, throughout the sections of the New Testament we're going to look at, we can kind of get or be reminded of some different aspects of Moses, and we can take that with us and kind of just take a minute to learn a little bit more or look at Moses through a different lens. So there are two real passages that have been pointed out where they specifically talk about Moses. We have Moses and Stephen's speech in Acts chapter 7. We also have Moses mentioned in what's being called this hall of faith. in Hebrews 11. And that's really where we're going to focus tonight, is Hebrews chapter 11. And specifically, if you're so inclined, verses 23 through 29. Okay? And there, like I said, there are more. We're really only going to focus on these two, just to kind of, it will serve its purpose. But if you go back and you familiarize yourself, or you are familiar with Hebrews 11, it's important to note that Moses is not the main character of Hebrews 11. He's arguably not the greatest Old Testament example of faith that it gives, or the person who receives the most attention for his faith. Arguably, that might be Abraham, simply because he has 12 verses mentioned in Hebrews 11. Moses has 7. But the Hebrew writer here, or the writer of Hebrews, really pours a lot into those 7 verses. And it all goes back to the book of Exodus. We'll specifically look at or talk about passages in Exodus chapter 2 throughout this. But we're just going to jump right in, okay, and start with Hebrews 11, verse 23. It says, "By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents, because they saw that the child was beautiful, and they were not afraid of the king's edict." I think this is an important starting point, because, quite honestly, what person's faith is not influenced, for better or for worse, by one's parents, if we really think of it that way. And so within these 7 verses, the writer of Hebrews takes a minute to talk about and reference just how important foundationally Moses' biological Amram and Jochebed were. And really, it commends them for their bravery. It would have taken a lot. To put it in words that some of us might be able to understand, we're talking about a mother and a father who are basically foregoing their right to their child for altruistic purposes and making sure that he survives. And I'm a young parent, but I can't fathom that, okay? I've seen that on the bad side professionally in my line of work, but this is not that. This is something much more sincere and loving to preserve this child's life. And it really does demand respect, what they were able to do. But on top of that, not just the bravery it took to do that, the intelligence that we have here. Because Jochebed was able to still insert herself into the life of her son. And that's going to come up later, the further we get into this. And not only is she taking this risk, this act of defiance against the government that would have meant she would have been put to death, she's able to, for lack of a better term, manipulate the situation so that she can still be around Moses. And what's going to happen if she can still be around Moses? Moses can get the opportunity to, even as a young child, learn about God. And because of his parents' willingness, bravery, and intelligence, we kind of get that opportunity here that I think it demands a lot of respect. Now, just kind of taking a step back, let's look at a verse discussing Moses in the Old Testament. It says, "One day, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. Now, you do see kind of differences between a lot of New Testament passages and Old Testament passages. One of the biggest differences to me that I see is when you're reading them, especially in the Old Testament, it's very matter of fact. This happened, and this happened. In the New Testament, you start getting more literary aspects, I guess is the word, to where you get more feeling and emotion behind it. I say that because people, especially the world that we live in, have taken this verse, Exodus chapter 2 and 11, and really kind of turned it in to this superhero moment for Moses. Point being, this is all true. The University of Indiana, they took verses like this and made a class out of studying superheroes like Superman and related it back to Moses. Okay? And I say that because typically, let's be honest with ourselves, when we're talking about this moment in Exodus, what's one of the first thing that pops into our head? What's the movie? For me, it was the Ten Commandments. I remember two parts of that movie. I was watching it when I was a kid at my grandmother's house, the one with Charlton Heston. The part where he parts the Red Sea. The other part is in this moment, okay, where he defends this slave. And I'm saying this because we need to back off of that view, because really what that's done is kind of possibly distorted what's really happening with Moses. It likes to give us this climactic aha moment of, oh, Moses has now discovered his past. He's going to really just be vehement for the Lord after this great moment of discovery for Moses. I don't think that's what happens here, and we'll get into that in a minute. So you see it too, like when I was a kid, we had in the 90s, The Prince of Egypt. It came out. Everybody went to see that. Same thing. I think they came out with a movie a few years ago. You get this same thing. Again, let's kind of hold off on that worldly view of this depiction of this time in Exodus, and let's look at what's written in this New Testament, in these New Testament passages, because what we're going to see is something vastly different. And I think it makes this whole Exodus part with Moses work so much better, and we can appreciate Moses so much better. So, that being said, let's go to the next couple of verses, 24 and 26. It says, "By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward." Okay? Now, I'm just speaking factually. Let's look at Moses' position even before Exodus 2:11. What did he have going for him? Quite literally everything. He was next in line to be Pharaoh. Anything that he wanted, he could have gotten. Okay? But when I'm reading those verses 24 through 26, that seemed very, very different to me than kind of what we just talked about. And when I read Exodus 2, it really doesn't occur to me to think that Moses just kind of happened upon the Israelites, okay? And again, that's kind of the worldly depiction that we get. He just happens upon this traumatic event, and that kind of changes or alters the course of his direction, his life. I don't think that we get that here. We have a lot of intention on Moses' part, okay? And it said, because it says by faith. In fact, every verse in this or every passage that we're looking at will say by faith. And again, we go back to looking at his parents, his biological parents. We don't need to kind of forget what Jochebed was able to do, because I think we need to understand that Moses had an understanding of his background, okay? He knew where he came from. And I think that there's probably the likelihood that this moment, he often spent time amongst his people. So much so that when he saw this, it did kind of trigger some type of action in his mind, but the understanding of who he was, where he was, and like quite possibly who he was going to follow was probably already there. And in that moment, he recognized a wrong. He responded to it. And, we don't need to forget just what he gave up by doing so. He gave up everything. I thought it also interesting that he considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt. I had to stop and kind of make sure I understood what that meant, the reproach of Christ. I think what we mean by that is, in general, I think this is fair to say, when we sin, when we commit this sin, there is a bit of shame. Maybe you're down on yourself a little bit. And that's really what the word reproach is getting to. And Christ, we know, we have kind of a comparison almost with Moses and Christ, because Moses kind of took on this mantle because maybe even in this moment he felt so much shame at what had happened. Not necessarily at what he did, but maybe how his people were being treated. And when you understand that he probably knew a lot more about his background than we give him credit for, it starts to make a lot more sense. And it makes you appreciate that really by him considering this reproach of Christ, really what that means, he's, yes, refusing to be Pharaoh's daughter, but he's open to enduring suffering because he recognized, even in this moment, that the reward, according to God and God's plan, is far greater than anything that he could have gotten, even if he had become Pharaoh, which he would have been in line to do. So I think that I can't say what I would do in most shoes in that scenario, but I know that I think it's very clear from this that his understandings, he was able to see this as an opportunity, and instead of standing by, he was able to take it as this opportunity to really start living his true purpose in life. So let's continue. Verse 27 says, by faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. And so Moses, leaving Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king. What anger? The writer of Hebrews, I think, assumes that we as the readers know this story in Exodus. We know Moses killed an Egyptian in defense of an Israelite. If you need to go back and look at that, it's Exodus chapter 2, 11 and 12. But Exodus kind of goes on to say that when Pharaoh heard about this, what did he do? He tried to kill Moses. And Moses, as a result, he fled from Pharaoh and he went to live in the land of Midian in verse 15, Exodus chapter 2. It kind of, when you look at it, when you read that in Exodus, it can kind of read that maybe Moses was afraid of the king or the Pharaoh's answer, but I don't get that when we look at Hebrews 27. In fact, it says not being afraid of the anger of the king. And that's fascinating to me, how we get such a different perception when we look at this through the New Testament, because of, I think Moses, it says in chapter 2, verse 14 in Exodus, that Moses, he was fearful about what he had done, okay? And he was fearful that he would be found out. I mean, their laws in that regard when you kill somebody, they haven't changed much. Even in this day and age, you can still get the same punishment. So naturally, he was kind of fearful about that. But maybe, that's, while that might be the obvious way of reading this, the story in Exodus, that he was naturally afraid of the king, the wording in Exodus, it does kind of leave open this possibility of, a different reading. And I think Hebrews really takes up that challenge by just giving it in a different way. He wasn't scared of the king. He was afraid of what he had done, okay? Instead, it's not Moses that was afraid, but rather like his parents before him, okay, Amram and Jochebed, his faith really motivated him to leave Egypt and preserve his life. And you see that in verse 27. So really, in other words, it wasn't fear that took Moses away from Egypt. It was faith. And that same faith that Moses had, he already knew that God had something better in store for him. But again, the next two things we kind of get a little bit more. Let's see. Verses 28 and 29. Okay. Faith, let's see, sorry, I'll get there. By faith, he kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. By faith, the people crossed the Red Sea as on dry land, but the Egyptians, when they attempted to do so, or to do the same, were drowned. Here we get other examples of how faith is leading Moses' actions. And not only does it enable him to institute the Passover and protect all the Israelites from this destroyer of the firstborn, and that was in Exodus chapter 12, verse 23, if you look back. Moses also led the Israelites through the Red Sea on dry ground because they also had faith. So, I mean, just in looking at those verses, again, I was very surprised. And we really need to take the time to appreciate that, one, the New Testament is taking the time to kind of reiterate not only the importance of these people, such as Moses, but also appreciate what they did, how they did it, but equally as important, why they did it. I mean, it's very obvious that Moses had a tremendous amount of faith, and he looked to the one who is unseen, it says in verse 27. We might think that this characteristic can kind of set Moses apart from us, since he spoke to God face to face. And, just thinking about that, I often have been jealous, if I'm being honest, because Moses had that opportunity. I don't know what that would feel like. I would be terrified, quite honestly, if that had happened to me. But Moses had this opportunity to communicate with God in a way that we never know. But at the same time, again, recalling what we've just discussed, he still showed this amount of reverence. I think that Paul at one point talks about how he would veil himself when he was communicating with God. Moses would. And it really doesn't get talked about enough how reverent Moses was. And that's something I think all of us can take away, because we see how that reverence kind of fueled his actions and his faith. So, again, Moses, he's never really criticized. If you go back and look at the New Testament, again, it's over 80 times that he's referenced in the New Testament. Moses is never really criticized. He is only esteemed. And he's lauded as one who spoke God's words to God's people. And he did it even though he was probably terrified to do it. He, just on a personal level, we all can relate to that feeling with Moses of being called upon to do something and being worried about how we'll do it, if I'll mess up. And yet, Moses did it anyway. He charged this again, he was the voice of God to the people of Egypt. He had help. I'm not taking away. We'll talk more about help throughout this class. But as one who was given such a high responsibility, it's really important for us to take this moment to really appreciate that, even from, this New Testament perspective, because of his obedience to God, his willingness to listen to his commands, and sometimes as a model of faith, or even, like I said, a type of Christ in the Old Testament. I think there's many comparisons you can make between some of Moses' actions and the actions that Christ had taken in the New Testament. Moses was able to do some of that. And again, it just speaks to the knowledge and the power of God, because he was able to not only take somebody who was very fearful of what they were being asked to do. God intentionally chose one of the best people that he could to do what I had mentioned at the very beginning, which was also kind of reiterate his own power and control over the world that he had created. And he had done that through Moses, who was next in line in Egypt. So, kind of like a lamp that appears so dark in a bright room, can only seem less brilliant when the shades are drawn and the sunlight pours in. That's kind of what the glory of Moses is like, which had seemed so radiant. It just, now again, I made this comparison between Moses and Christ. They're not equal. I do have to acknowledge that nothing compares to the glory of Christ. But here, Moses gives this opportunity to see, even in the Old Testament, we have, as Christians, an example of faith that we can take with us. And I just totally blanked right there in the middle of that thought. Since we have this shining example of faith, even looking at it through the New Testament perspective, I think that we can really, one, appreciate really what Moses did, which, again, one of the biggest takeaways that I took from this is it kind of changing my own perception of what really happened, because it's hard for me at times not to view Moses in this way that has been depicted in movies, television, and all of that, and we really don't get that according to these verses. Instead, we get somebody who was put there intentionally, who knew what they were doing, and because of that knowledge, their actions led to that faith, which also led to all of these great examples that, if you just recalling back the example that I had before, if you had to make people make these Mount Rushmores, right? Moses, I think, would be on the Mount Rushmore faith. So hopefully that, I know I'm getting done a little bit early, hopefully that kind of gives you a brief kind of introduction to what we'll be focusing on throughout this quarter, and so that we can really take these opportunities in the Old Testament that we all know and really kind of view them from the lens of the New Testament and take away more from them. So we get a few minutes to socialize. I apologize for ending early like that, but thank you for your attention.
Good evening. Welcome to the Pulaski Street Church of Christ. We're thankful to have all of you here with us tonight. For those of you that are visiting with us, we're especially grateful to have you and encourage you to come back every chance that you have. And those are not just empty words. We mean it. We love that you're here. We do have several that we want to update you on and ask for prayers concerning. Thomas Word, who is the 2-year-old great-nephew of Chris Harris, has been admitted to the PICU at Baptist Memorial Hospital in Memphis with seizures, and we have been requested to pray for Thomas Word. Judy Bryant had surgery late Monday afternoon at Vanderbilt to remove her right adrenal gland. That surgery went well, and Judy returned home today. And she is getting around a lot better today. The doctor said that the surgery went as expected and pathology results will be available in about a week. Judy is thankful for the prayers and support to this point, and let's continue to keep her in our prayers. Brent McKamey was released from Vanderbilt UMC yet last evening from a 15-day stay in Vanderbilt. He had heart-related tests on Monday, and the cardiologist said Darren's atrial fibrillation is a reaction to the initial reasons for his stay there in ICU, the trach, the infection, pneumonia, aspiration, active bleeds, etc. Clearly, there's been a lot. And this will be managed with medication moving forward. And he also noted a slight blockage and that a valve is functioning a bit irregularly. And those are concerns that will be regularly monitored by a cardiologist. The tracheostomy site is finally healing, and the trach will stay in place for a few more weeks. Darren is, though, scheduled for scans and another treatment next Monday, July the 6th. So we're very thankful for the improvements. Let's continue to keep Darren and the family in our prayers. Larry Pope has had another area of skin cancer removed, and unfortunately, the margins were not clear. And so Larry is scheduled to return tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. to have more of the area removed. He is still scheduled to see his heart surgeon tomorrow afternoon to schedule his double bypass surgery. Kenneth Kelly, who attended here in the past with the late Francis Chafin, is in declining health and has been placed on hospice care at the home of his son. His mailing address is in the bulletin, and he would appreciate receiving cards. Linda McAnally, the sister of Judy Butler, was recently hospitalized with congestive heart failure and pneumonia. And she improved some and went to a rehab facility for therapy, but she fell today. And she hit her head and suffered significant blood loss, and she is having scans and tests and being treated for a buildup of fluid around her heart and lungs. And she also has a UTI, so there's a lot going on there with Linda. Let's keep all of these in our prayers, as well as others that have been mentioned recently. Some reminders. The Lions who have been participating on the Make Me a Servant Days this week, we will be going to Ten Pin Alley tomorrow, and we are going to have a brief meeting as soon as Bible class is over down in the Lions Den, going over some of the details on that. Independence Day, the 4th of July, is this Saturday, so we hope everyone will stay safe and enjoy time with family and friends. We had Bible class promotion tonight. Hopefully, I didn't hear of any issues or concerns with that, but we will do that again on Sunday, July the 5th. Bible class promotion, so new adult classes will begin on Sunday morning, and the children's classes, if you are going up to the next age group, you will go to that next class. This coming Sunday, July the 5th, we will also have a special contribution to help offset the cost of the youth group's summer mission trip to Bridgeport, West Virginia. Anything given that is over our regular budget will be applied to this, so please consider that as you make your plans to give this coming Sunday. Several of our youth and adults will be attending Horizons at Freed-Hardeman University this Sunday, July the 5th, through Friday, July the 10th, and that will it's always a great week. We look forward to it. We ask that you keep us in your prayers as we go. I know that we've got a couple that are going to be going down to Wiregrass and others that are going to be retrieved from Wiregrass down in South Alabama this weekend. So let's keep the Morphews and Smiths in our prayers as well as they make that trip. We will be meeting for Feast this coming Sunday, July the 5th at 5:30 p.m. in the new building. And the last thing on here, there's been a lot. The last thing is that the Pulaski Street Church softball team is scheduled to play on Field 2 at Bobby Brewer Park at 7 p.m. next Tuesday, July the 7th, and next Thursday, July the 9th. So we've had a lot of people in the past that have been like, hey, I didn't know there was a game. Well, you're going to be finding out when there's games. Next Tuesday, next Thursday, 7 o'clock, Field 2. And you can go out and watch some young and not so young people play softball. And I hope y'all got enough, because there's going to be a lot of us out of town. But y'all can figure that out. Is anybody in here a perfectionist? I can be a perfectionist about certain things, but not about all things. And I think that's probably true of anyone that would consider themselves a perfectionist. Other things that aren't in your little list of stuff that you're as passionate about or whatever, it's like, okay, whatever. It's not a big deal. But the pursuit of perfection can cause some problems in our lives. It can bring about stress. It can bring about worry. It can bring about guilt if things don't go as we thought they would, or if we don't perform up to the standards that we have set for ourselves. And I don't want to give anybody the wrong idea. I am in no way saying that pursuing righteousness and attempting every moment of every day to make the right choice is a bad idea, because that is our goal as followers of Christ. But if all we ever focus on is keeping every bit of the gospel and the law that we live under perfectly, we have set ourselves up for failure. Paul said as much in Romans chapter 4, where he is pointing out to us that the promises of God are realized through faith, not through perfection. In verse 14, if it is only the adherents of the law or those that keep the law who are to be heirs, faith is null and God's promise is void. The sense of flawless performance, as far as perfection is concerned, is something that is an impossible standard for us as human beings. It is folly because it's chasing something that God never told us we could attain in this life. Instead, we should focus on following the one who was perfect. If we go back into the Old Testament in Micah chapter 6 and verse 8, we see that God asks us to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with Him. He doesn't ask us to achieve flawless lives. In the book of Proverbs, chapter 24 and verse 16, talks about how the righteous will fall 7 times and then rise again. Righteousness is not about avoiding failure. It's continually getting back up. In Philippians chapter 3, verses 12 through 14, Paul talks about how he has not already obtained or been made perfect, but he presses on. His aim wasn't that perfection, but it was being faithful. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 9, Paul talks about how the power of God is made perfect in our weaknesses, not in being able to handle things on our own. So flawlessness is not something that we should really be seeking, but faithfulness is. And instead of worrying about perfection, we should be worrying about getting better, moving in the right direction, not worrying about making things look right, but actually being obedient. If we feel like we can never fail, then we will give up when we do. But if I follow Christ, I will know that when I fail, I can go to Him, and He will make all things right. Tonight you may be here. You might be a perfectionist. You might not. And when you mess up, God's promises state that He can redeem us. And through Christ's completed work at the cross, that has been done. But we must seek Him, follow Him, and turn to Him when we have made mistakes. So if you're here tonight and you've made a mistake, there's no better place to be right now, because you're in a room full of people that love you and want nothing more than you to be in a right and saving relationship with God. Maybe you need to come forward and ask for prayers of forgiveness, prayers of comfort, prayers of strength. We would love to be here for you. Or perhaps you're here and you want to put your faith in Christ and the redemptive work that the cross has accomplished, knowing that your sins will be taken away through your obedience to the gospel. As you commit to change your life, to look more like Him, to show that progress, you confess Him as your Lord and Savior and are willing to be buried in the waters of baptism for the forgiveness of your sins. Whatever the need may be, if you're subject to the invitation tonight, would you please come as we stand and sing?
There's a fountain free, 'tis for you and me. Let us haste to its brink. 'Tis a fount of love from the source above, and He bids us all freely drink. Will you come to the fountain free? Will you come? 'Tis for you and me, thirsty soul. Hear the welcome call. 'Tis a fountain open for all. There's a rock that's cleft and no soul is left that may not its pure water share. 'Tis for you and me, and its stream I see. Let us hasten joyfully there. Will you come to the fountain free? Will you come? 'Tis for you and me, thirsty soul. Hear the welcome call. 'Tis a fountain open for all. Just a reminder for the Lions to meet, who are going to the rewards day tomorrow down in the Lions Den immediately after. Let us go to God in prayer. Our Father in heaven, we thank you so much for this day you have blessed us with. We thank you for the opportunity to get to be here today and to worship you. Take a time out of the middle of our week to just be able to disconnect and understand a little bit more about your word. We thank you for the opportunity to be able to grow closer to you through this study of the word. We ask that you keep us on the straight and narrow. We thank you so much for your Son. It's in his name that we pray. Amen.